Good morning. My name is Gary Kleiman. I'm the chair of the Nuclear Metals Inc. Starmet Reuse Planning Committee. I'm calling this public meeting to order at 8 a.m. Committee will be discussing the final report prepared by SKIO, the planning process for the summer, and assignment of various topics. In accordance with Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Order of March 12, 2020, suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, we're conducting this meeting virtually. To ensure public access to the deliberations of the meeting, the public may access this call through video conferencing or telephone. Following the committee's discussion, members of the public will have the opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment. If you wish to provide feedback, you'll need to raise your hand. If you are video conferencing, go to the Participants tab at the bottom of the screen and click on it. Once that window's open, go to the bottom and click on Raise Hand. The chair, myself, will call on you, and your mic will be unmuted by the host. Please identify yourself with name and address for the record. You can also raise your hand from your phone by dialing *9. If you haven't already done so, please identify yourself on the screen. You do this by clicking on the 3 carets at the top of your image box and clicking on the Rename feature. All video screens will be turned off with the exception of the committee members, Select Board Liaison Linda Escobedo, and Marcia Rasmussen. Screen sharing will not be permitted unless absolutely necessary. All votes will be taken by roll call vote. In the event that this meeting is Zoom bombed and we're not able to get control of the meeting back, all matters on the agenda that have not been heard will be automatically continued to a future meeting to be scheduled. At this time, I would ask the committee members to introduce themselves. Boy, I don't know who would want to Zoom bomb our call, but okay. I will start with introductions in the order that I see people listed in my participants pane, and it's just committee members, right? So Jim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, Jim Burns, Concord Housing Development Corporation is my contact.
Paul, go ahead.
Paul Bohm, 11 Ridgewood Road, Concord, co-chair.
I don't know if we're introducing staff, but Marcia, why don't you just say hi?
Hello.
You're muted.
Hello, Marcia Rasmussen, Planning Director, Concord Department of Planning and Land Management.
Andrew?
Andrew Boardman, 110 Hillcrest Road, member.
Carl?
Carl Seidman, 93 Wright Road.
Pam?
Pam Rockwell, 1810 Main Street in Concord, from the 2229 Main Street Committee.
And Jerry is our host. And Kate, I guess you're joining as a member of the public, but you can introduce yourself as being a member of the planning board as well.
Okay, hi, good morning. I'm Kate McEnany, 30 Union Street. I'm a member of the planning board and joining as a member of the public, and look forward to the meeting. Thanks for all your work on the committee, everyone.
Great. So I think that takes care of all the legalities, and glad to have Kate joining us. She had expressed some interest in this site and the planning work we're doing, so glad to have her interest. So at this point, unless anybody has any other comments, I would turn to the agenda. And we're going to try and compact our normal meeting into 1 hour and 15 minutes, as the agenda indicates, and leaving some time for public comment. So if we can get our business out of the way, you know, in 1 hour, hour and 5, then Kate can have 10 minutes to enlighten us. Okay, the first item on the agenda is the SKIO report. Marcia has sent the link around. Hopefully people had a chance to look at it. I think it's a great resource. I guess my question back to Marcia is, did you have suggestions or recommendations on how to deploy this or what we should be doing with it? Or is it just kind of a good job, SKIO? And it probably relates a little bit to the next agenda item, not to skip out a turn, but I mean, I think originally we had envisioned this would be useful for planning our outreach, but maybe Marcia, you want to say a word about what you're thinking now in terms of this report, and if you or Jerry can inform us, what are we allowed to do in terms of public outreach and stuff in light of COVID? Thank you.
Well, a number of questions there. Yes, this document can serve as an outreach and an informational piece, and I think you should use it in that way. What are you allowed to do? You're allowed to continue to get the word out and the information out as you want. We're not meeting in a public setting as a group yet, and so that what you're going to be talking about is what does public outreach look like in the time of COVID. I think you might use that as the document as a springboard for your direction to DeMaximus as they're planning the next phase of cleanup, which they need to do which they've started actually, and they are using this document, but to alert the public that this is the document that they are relying on as you move forward, given where we are in that process. So that's what I have to offer.
So a follow-up question. And so I understand we're not allowed to have a public forum, which is, what we had envisioned in sort of the May timeframe. We're not allowed to meet publicly, but are we allowed, I mean, in terms of restrictions on your time and stuff like that, are we allowed to start planning sort of virtual public outreach, maybe do a Survey Monkey or something like that, to try and do what we had intended? Because I want to turn next to the committee and ask if people have ideas, but I just want to make sure, like, can we ask you to do things for us, or are you on restricted duty, that kind of thing?
I am working. I spend 2 days a week in the office and work from home the other 3. I have a lot going on in terms of how we plan for reopening, and we do expect to open offices to town staff in the next week or 2, either June 1st or June 8th. From there, we'll look at a second phase where we begin to allow the public into buildings by appointment, most likely, and limited access to where they can go in a building. And then we're going to be unrolling things or reopening things very slowly. So it's a challenging time, and that's where a lot of my energy is. But a lot of there are other committees and boards who are continuing to do work. Most of them are the regulatory boards, but I know the Economic Vitality Task Force is looking at some of the economics of the impact on our local businesses and what can be done to improve the economy for them. So I think, given that this particular site is going to be, they're working on a design and moving forward with the remediation there, that you need to begin considering how do you reach out to people. And I am available to assist you with those kinds of things, or we can find different consultants or go back to EPA and see if there's somebody who could help with that.
Okay, so I want to turn it to the committee now and see if people have thoughts on the SKIO report, how we use it, and really I'm merging into the next agenda item, which is, how we would plan for some kind of public outreach, virtual public outreach, to try and gather the kind of information and inputs on our concept for redevelopment thus far, prior to May, when we, sort of told DeMaximus we would try to get them answers. Obviously, I know Paul and Pam are very eager to get information about what we think about Area A2. I think there are, probably 2 or 3 other key questions that we probably want to somehow find a way to put to the public and get some public input. So do committee members have thoughts on what are the key issues that we need how we use this report and what other things do we need to think about as we dig into sort of doing some due diligence on other aspects of it.
Just a point on timing, because I did ask Bruce Thompson about timing, their timing, our timing, and he said that they really should have a pretty good concept in mind by July. So his time frame is coming up here, not that far away. So we haven't missed it. A couple of really quick comments on the report. I think it's a really good, comprehensive report. There's some edits to it. I don't want to spend time with edits. Marcia, should I get you edits?
This is done for them.
It's done.
I know that there are edits. There were things in there I saw, but I provided comments back to them.
Oh, okay.
Not all of them got incorporated, but this
It's done.
is the final. We
Okay.
already had a pass at this.
Okay. They cut off half of our committee charge. Maybe you noticed that in there. So no matter. I did find it, the discussion of ownership options was very interesting. And another sort of action item that we have, although it's not the highest priority for the select board right now, is the ownership issue. And I think they presented in here some ownership options that we hadn't thought of. For example, separate ownership of the holding basin. So it's interesting. And I don't know how. So, I mean, we have two paths here. One is with the public and one is keep advising the select board. I don't know what more, if anything, we should do or need to do on advising the select board on the taking ownership of the site, or who's doing that independently. So, I mean, that's a big question mark. Where does that pathway go? So,
Right.
but I think the report's very helpful in that regard. So,
So Pam, you're next.
So I would agree with Paul that I actually think that ownership issue is a big deal, and that is something, because there is a listing in there of who are the lien holders, that we could use that to go back to the selectmen and say, it's time to tell the lawyers to figure it out. So that because there's a point where we're ready to do that. And I think, and the other,
Just on that point, I think we already did go back to the select board and say it's time to have the lawyers figure it out. Marcia, I wonder if there's a way to follow up with the select board, or I don't know, maybe Linda's on the call, to find out if they have taken any steps to talk to town council, because we did advise that, but I don't know whether they did.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I can
Yeah.
check in with the town manager and find out if Linda's not available.
Okay. So yeah, it's a good point, Pam and Paul, and that one, I think we already did take one step in that direction, but it's worth reinforcing, yeah.
and the other point is that the use of A2, the description of A2, and whether that is something that that is going to be how much it would be excavated, that's actually the only other thing that Bruce really needs to know, right?
well, I think there's other leveling. I mean, there are other areas that the report refers to leveling. A2 is the biggest kind of question mark. So, I mean, in terms of moving dirt on the site, it's A2, but there are other leveling questions in other areas.
Right. I mean, we've kind of talked about, A1, there's no question, level for prepare for development. A2, there's this question. I think even A3 and A4, there's some question like, do we think A3 should be prepped for, leaching fields and, some other use that's compatible with that on top? Do we need to decide that now? Do we want to leave A4 alone for now and, have it trees and, some rolling hills, or leave it as it is? Or do we want to level it and have it ready for development now or later? So, I mean, I think there are questions that we could ask. My question is, within the framework of the general concept, which ones do we need to ask before July? Because otherwise, I think we should just proceed with more due diligence on, what is the nature of the institutional relationships, the ownership question, the financing, and then, all else can be revealed in time.
So A4, right, is not going to be touched by the cleanup. Unless we say we want it excavated or something like that. No, that's not a question at all. If we're decided that A1 is going to be developed probably, and we want it restored to be developed, then really A2 and A3 are the only questions. that for Bruce to get started at this point.
And I think the big decision he needs to know is on A2. I think everything, because
I think you're
that involves a cleanup. Development of A3 and A4 can proceed 10 years from now, and if somebody needs to level it, they can do that, but that doesn't impact the cleanup. A2 is a cleanup question. So I think that's the one, Gary.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Gary, you're muted.
A2, isn't that the site that has the potential excavate that could be used to the
Yes.
clean
Right.
fill?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and it's A3 that has the sweeping, so that's going to be impacted in
Right.
some fashion. So it's how it's left that is
Right.
the issue, I think, for the committee.
Right.
And so I think that also has implications for the cleanup. But anyway,
I mean, Gary,
Carl.
I mean, it does seem we do have these alternative reuse concepts that impact that development, and we haven't really gone back to the public to share those and get feedback on them. So it does seem like we need to at least make that more public, solicit more feedback and comment on it before, as a committee, we make a final recommendation, to inform the design of the cleanup. I mean, I am concerned a little bit that how we contextualize that. I think the scale report is good, but not everyone's going to, read through it completely. So I do think if we present these three alternatives, I think the committee should present some sort of brief explanation of how we arrived at them, what some of the concerns and issues are, work a little on the risk communication, because I do think there'll be a sort of gut reaction to the inclusion of housing. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I was just going to say, I think there are clearly, Carl, a number of things we have to discuss in some form with the public. The issue here is what we discussed with Bruce and his team for input to their job in the next.
Right, but do we do that? Do we do that without any public input? That was my question, because we've done these three scenarios internally.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's been no discussion of that with the public, so I'm a little uncomfortable just internally making our own recommendation without sharing that more broadly with the public and getting some feedback on that.
I'll have to say, we did actually present it to the Board of Selectmen, and the Board of Selectmen at that point said they were on board with the idea of us actually planning to develop the A1 area and finding out more information about A2.
But Pam, again, to Carl's point, when we presented to the Board of Selectmen, we said we are going to go to the public with this plan to make sure that the public wants it. So I just want to be careful about us not saying this is what we want to do with this site without, I don't want to get too far out ahead of the public.
I think if we go, well, I don't know how to go to the public. That was the earlier discussion, but if we go to the public with a recommendation and ask for comments, I think that's great. If we go to the public and say, what do you think? I don't think that's great. That opens up.
Marcia.
I think what you have is a plan that has potential for 3 different scenarios into the future. And what you're working with is a site, I think Pam and Paul are probably right, that determining how A2 is used for the cleanup is probably the most critical issue in terms of how the site is left. I don't think we're going to be able to answer what the final design and development for this property is at this point in time because of all the other moving parts, because of where we are with our economy and the questions that we have about our market needs 8 to 10 years into the future. So what I like about where you are in the SKIA report is that we have a good basic plan that allows for 3 different redevelopment scenarios that can benefit the community in a variety of different ways. And I think that might be how you frame going forward. But that's just my take on what I read yesterday and have been thinking about.
Right. So I think what we need is some member of the committee to volunteer to draft, I don't know what Carl or Marcia thinks is appropriate, a half-page paragraph or two that contextualizes the master plan concept, and maybe have a couple of visuals of the master planning concept and these three potential development scenarios that could be supported by the master plan concept, and the key question or two or recommendation that we're asking for public feedback on around A2, A3, and support or lack of for the master planning concept, right? And we want to get that on some kind of a Survey Monkey, blast it out, have it on a web link or something like that, blast it out on news and notices, and see if we can get some people to weigh in on just where we're at.
So I'm sorry, Pam. You may want to do as you did at the beginning and go back to the boards and committees that you all talked with to say, this is where we are, this is how we're moving forward, and this is our recommendation at this point. Is there anything here that you want us to expand on or add or take out?
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
Okay. So we have this other thing that's going on right now is that that Bruce released some documents about the remedial design planning. He did that about a month ago. I only found out about it this weekend because I fell off of his list. But part of that is that we need to review that and see what it says about the section A2. From my perspective, from my other committee, one of the things that I was planning to do was to have my NRC person actually start the discussion with the NRC about what we need for information in order to make the decision about A2. Because we would want Bruce to give us the transportation, what's the balance of using the on-site versus off-site stuff for that. And that's a decision that we could get people into now because we do kind of have that July deadline for that one. So we could start and say, whatever we do with this site, this is an urgent thing to inform you about and start thinking about.
Yeah, you raise a good point. I think I had asked Bruce about, I said, haven't you guys done a net environmental benefit analysis, for example, of trucking versus, and they said, yeah, they do that all the time and they could do that pretty easily. So I think so first of all, I think the executive summary here is really good. Anybody can read it. It's a really good communication piece. They don't have to read the rest. But along with that, the decision on A2 needs to be informed by some net environment, some analysis, which we could ask Bruce to do because it's in his interest to get that resolved. And that would help inform the public as well, because I think that's the calculus that we have to think about.
I think some of that is already in the SKIO report. If you go down to the section where they discuss A2, they talk about how many truckloads of.
Right, but in terms of, there's the next level, there's environmental benefit, there's carbon emissions and noise, and so those trade-offs. And it's just a thought. I don't know if he's willing to do that.
Carl, you're up next.
Yeah, it does seem like our basic issue around these reuse plans is, do we want, as a committee, want to recommend to go to the public with proposing that we keep all three options open and that the site be prepared in such a way and utilize A2 in such a way that we could pursue any of these three options in the future? Or do we want to propose really focusing on the reuse option that really sticks to A1? I mean, it seems like that's really where we are in the decision process now. And it would be good to kind of pose that question, to other stakeholders. But I think as folks have said, I'm not sure where we as a committee feel we have the information to kind of, deliberate and make a decision on that.
Can I ask what's the committee sense? We've been talking around this and punting to the public each time we do this. What's our, I'm not saying we take a vote, but what's our sense on what Carl's saying, the two options. We leave everything open, or we declare something as we did at A2 to allow for some options. Go ahead.
I heard Carl's thesis as slightly different. It's not, I mean, you're asking a question about A2, and I think that what Carl was saying is more about the timing of development of A1, A2, A3, A4. And it's like, let's focus on A1 now, planning for A1 now. And A2, A3, A4, we can decide on development in the future. That's what I heard as Carl's question. I agree that you and Pam are making very clear Bruce needs a decision on A2 by July. So that to me is a separate question, but I think both are related. And, we definitely need to get, I think, public input on both questions.
So what I heard from Carl, though, was that we don't want to destroy A2 if we're going to make the decision
Right.
to only use A1. And so are we actually going to try to push that forward? And the thing that I was thinking of is that if we end up going to a bunch of groups and they say, no way are we going to let you take A2 apart, then that decision is made for us. If the NRC says, no, we should leave the trees, and if, other community groups are like, no, we want this barrier, then we have that answer in that respect. But you're right, that if the answer is, well, we're not sure about this, then it gets taken down, then we can't go back and restore it the way it is now.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's exactly why
Right.
I hear a lot of good arguments on the side of we should use A2 for backfill, but that's exactly, your point, Pam, is exactly why I'm hesitant to do that without getting some public input. I don't know whether there would be backlash or not. And, it would help if we had some environmental analysis. So, all of this is right. And I agree, they're related questions, but I guess I saw the A1, focus temporally versus the A2 as backfill as separate questions, but clearly related. So you're right.
Well, the thing that I'm saying, though, is that I need that answer for another process, which is the site planning for the remedial design, not for, in other words, I can, if we can rule out that we're going to use, not if the decision is from the town that we don't want to disturb A2, then the other decisions are kind of made for us. And that decision, that is the one that actually has the time limit on it, not which, I need to get that information from my committee one way or another, whether we're going to use A2 or not.
Well, I have two questions on this. Question number one is who makes this decision? Question number two is what is our recommendation to the committee? Because anybody we talk to is going to say, well, what does the committee want to do? I am hesitant to go outside the committee with sort of just an open-ended question. Well, what do you guys think?
Jim.
I'm kind of a little bit in the dark. What was I don't think I read the report that you talked about recently produced by Bruce. How did you get a hold of that?
So you were actually on the email copy of that, and it is basically the work plan for the remedial design. And so that actually is an email that I can send you another copy to it. It's a bunch of links. It's like a gigabyte of stuff. So,
okay.
So it's not something that a non-technical person would normally read through, but in it is going to be things like what studies are going to be done. And so if we want the transportation and the environmental study for A2 done, we need to be sure that it's in there.
Okay.
And when he starts his remedial design process, he needs to know whether he can actually take down A2 or not.
When was that sent out?
That was sent out in April, but I didn't get it until last week. So, but your name was on the list, so look for it. But I'll send you another copy.
All right, thank you. I apologize for missing that. I thought I've spent most of my time worrying about whether it's actually the town would accept having housing placed in that area, because there's, a fair amount of pushback from actually having housing constructed in that area because of the presence at one time of nuclear material. That's been a tricky thing.
Not an A2, but
No.
anyway.
No, I mean in general.
Yeah,
Right.
well, that's a whole,
Right.
the risk communication part we haven't even touched on.
Right.
It's a
Yeah, that's
whole nother public thing.
So, Paul, you were saying that the executive summary opening paragraphs was a good communication device. Do you feel like it adequately addresses the risk communication piece as well, or do we need to nuance that a little bit more before we send out a link to a website asking for some feedback?
It does not address risk communication directly. It does say, it articulates the cleanup goals and talks about residential standards, so that's a beginning to a risk communication. That's a tricky, risk communication is a,
Right. So I'm just trying to get very practical here because it's already 8:35. I want to move on. And so I think we've all agreed that we need to, do some public outreach here virtually. So we have a couple of paragraphs there. I think, Pam, didn't we do a little something on risk communication for either the journal or something with David's input?
We did do something small, and I was planning on expanding it with him at some point, but I haven't yet. So
But can we go back to that now and just pull a paragraph that we add to, what's in the opening paragraphs of the SKIO report so that we at least have some introductory contextualization? And Carl, I don't know if you would do that or.
Yeah, I mean, I could take a shot at it. I mean, I do think if indeed we need to get feedback to inform a decision about A2, I think that has to be part of the background we provide to people and have some sense of the environmental trade-offs there. If we utilize A2, we're going to reduce truck traffic and the environmental costs associated with that. If we come up with a plan, a remediation plan that does use that for backfill, we're going to reduce those impacts, but we're going to, remove a wooded area. I mean, I think that has to, that's really part of what we want feedback on as well, the reuse plan, but also what we do with this site. So and that really isn't very explicit in the executive summary. So, but I could take a shot at a page or so and maybe the questions, a few questions we want to pose in a survey. I don't think it should be very long.
I think that would be great. If you could give the committee just a page of text. Marcia, did you have a question or no? Okay, and then I think the other thing is some visuals have to go along with this. And I guess the question of the committee is, are we comfortable with the kind of, 3 PowerPoint slide or 4 PowerPoint slides that we have now? Or do we want to try and make a spiffier version of the master plan concept or whatever we're calling it? Otherwise, we just got.
I think at this point, the slides we have are illustrative. They, you're basically saying these are examples of things that we came up with. They're not final, but and then I don't think workshopping that has much value at this point.
Okay, great. So I guess we'll have to talk about timing, but we have a plan we'll get a draft of, what we want to share with the public to get some feedback. And then, so we'll meet again to review it and ask Marcia to distribute it and get some feedback, hopefully in time to inform Bruce and the cleanup process.
So I just want to leave this discussion with my 2 questions are still pending. We don't have to answer them here. Question number 1 is how this decision is made and by whom. And question number 2 is what is this committee's recommendation to the public on this matter? Because right now we basically, we're presenting a whole series of options, but we haven't weighed in on what do we think about A2 specifically. We don't have to answer that now, but those are the 2 questions. How do we get feedback? And the 3 people, can 3 people veto the whole thing, or do we need 4 committees? And then what's this committee's sense of this? So let's leave those questions outstanding.
Well, I'm very happy if you want to do a quick poll of what people think about, a particular issue. On the what is the committee's recommendation or whatever, I think we're going to see a draft of whatever Carl puts together as, what we're requesting feedback on. So we'll look at that, and that can be the time where we decide. If you don't feel like it's making a strong enough recommendation one way or the other, we can edit that.
Okay.
But
I'm probably not going to make a recommendation because the committee hasn't done that. So, but we could add that. We could add that to the draft.
yeah, I mean, do you want to do a quick poll? Or, I mean, you seem eager to get folks.
I think we should. I mean, the question really is, do we want to recommend to Bruce that they take Phil from A2 because that's part of one or several development options? I mean, that's the question.
Well,
Or
I thought, Paul, that you wanted an environmental assessment before you made that decision to understand what the trade-offs were in terms of all these other aspects, the truck traffic, the carbon, sequestering and so forth, versus using it on site. So I'm not sure that the committee should, maybe that you are, but I'm surprised to hear you push that.
I could say
that was more for public. When we go out to the public, I think to have that behind us. My sense is we need to do that, and it's, environmentally it's going to be neutral or beneficial. It's just my sense. But well, if the committee needs that study to make the decision, then that's on a critical path to moving forward.
I guess I looked at it a little bit differently in that I really think it would be a good thing to reuse soil from the site to fill the site, and that it would be very valuable to have A2 as a level area to do development. And that's my personal opinion about that. And that if I wanted to sell that to the rest of the town, that I would need to have buy-in from all the different people that might actually have a different opinion and speak for the trees better than I do. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll share that I've been working with some of the people who are trying to preserve trees in Concord, and my inclination is for all areas of the site that have not been disturbed, let sleeping dogs lie, let's leave them alone. But I would be swayed by information on what the level of greenhouse gas or other, savings might be, or if there are NRC impacts or whatever. So I personally would like to see that technical study, but my initial inclination is leave it alone. It's a nice hill with trees. I think there's plenty of development we can do on A1 and A3, that will be enough for the town to chew on for a while. So that's my opinion. I don't know if anybody else wants to offer opinions, but you're welcome to.
So could I actually say real quick, Gary, could you possibly send me a list of some of these people? Because I actually need to kind of get those opinions together if I'm going to come up with a response for Bruce for the design plan and say that we need this information. So having for me to be able to talk to some of those people for my other role would be very nice. So I need some more speak for the trees people on my list to talk to.
Sure.
I sort of agree with that, Gary. I mean, I see it's probably better to have denser development on A1, which has already been disturbed, than fully developing the site. But once again, I would be concerned on two sides. Are there other environmental impacts that would affect that? And also, what is the fill that's going to be brought in? It might be less risky to use the fill that we know what it is on the site. And if we have to truck another fill, what risk does that pose? So those are questions that might change my mind about it. But I'd say, without that information, I would sort of say, let's focus on A1.
Andrew and Jim, just be a quick sense of it.
I mean, my sense is that what the town is getting a large area that's perfectly flat, perfectly developable, and that's an area that you can leverage later, that there's less of a need for having every inch of the land ready to go right now, where there may not be funding, there may not be, a whole host of other issues. And it can always be leveled later. That's my inclination right now. If you don't have a use for it within the next 10 years that you've identified that says, look, we're going to put this here and this is how we're going to pay for it, I don't see a need to flatten it. And then, lose the carbon absorption and all the other environmental, water runoff and all those other issues that tend to stem from clear cutting. But that's where I sit right now. But again, an environmental report saying, hey, this is actually better for everything, that it's going to reduce the emissions, that we can put small plantings in now and it'll offset a certain amount of runoff and all these other issues. They could sway me either way.
Jim?
My feeling is that probably for reasons of folks who'll get upset if we start cutting tree or have the trees cut down, et cetera, all kinds of work should be avoided and try to work around it, particularly these days and where money's going to become an issue, et cetera. So, but I don't think I have enough information to go beyond that. So I have to do some more thinking about it. But I would not write it now, just say it's time to get the bulldozers out, knock down the trees and level everything there. I think that would probably be a problem for a number of important people or community types in the town.
Okay, so I think we little sense of the committee there, but let's by all means let Carl put together a request for more public input on all this stuff, and we'll try and get that moving at an upcoming meeting. So I want to move on to trying to make some forward progress as a committee while we are unable to meet virtually, meet in person. We had talked about, doing this great public forum, maybe a site visit in May, where we would, sort of get the big town thumbs up. Okay, we have a master concept. Cleanup's going to begin. Let's start planning. And we would do some due diligence. And so we just kind of put together on the agenda here, you'll see there's 9 potential topics. Well, 8 potential topics, and then, we're excluding legal questions because we're hoping, and Marcia's going to follow up, unless, I thought I saw Linda trying to join, but I don't see her unless she's the caller number 1. But we'll follow up with the select board to see if indeed they are following up on legal issues. And I'm not sure if town or, ownership options is the same as the legal issues, because, it sounds like we want some feedback or had questions about ownership issues, which may be the same as the legal issues. But these other 8 topics, I guess I want to open it up for people's opinions. Are these some of the critical things that we should be addressing? Do people want to volunteer to take some of these on? I guess there's no names associated with them now. I had some ideas on who could do each of these, but I guess we have taken those off so that everybody can feel free to volunteer unless you want me to assign you, because I have some thoughts. And then, if you have your own ideas, what are the critical things we can be doing? And I know we can't form subcommittees, it's difficult. We can't, open meeting law, we can't work as teams without having these public Zoom calls. But one-on-one, we can each individually do some research on this stuff, and then at a future call, we can all report back.
So-
Mr. Gary, I had just given some feedback to Marcia on the market research piece. I think it's gonna be very difficult to do meaningful market research at this particular point in time, because there's so much uncertainty about the whole COVID-19 long-term impact, how is it going to affect the use of office space with his work and a shift at home? What's going to happen to the retail economy? So I think any market research that would be done now, would have a lot of question marks associated with it. So I think that would not probably, I'd say, it would be good to wait a year or so until we know more about, how this crisis and economic changes are impacting it. So that was sort of my one, question about the list of topics. I think the other topics certainly make a lot of sense.
It's a very good point. What I'm wondering is, how do you handle that in a report that's due in December? I mean, is there a way to caveat or qualify our report and still move forward with some recommendations on institutional relationships and, case studies and examples of redevelopment and, potential municipal needs where we have not included a market research component? I mean, that.
Right. I mean, I think we could discuss it and point to the need that, before any final zoning is put in place, some more market research is needed. But, we're many years away from actual development happening. It doesn't seem to me like a critical path issue. I mean, what the balance is between municipal uses, recreational uses, commercial and housing, I don't think we have to, come to a final decision on now.
Great.
Gary, I think there's one that's not on here that we talked about. It should be an action item, which is I'll call this net environmental benefit analysis that with trucking. And I think if we're going to ask Bruce to do that, one or several of us need to engage with him. So I would put that on the list. It sounds like we'd like to have
Paul, can
Yeah.
we work together on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to do
Okay.
that. The
So
other one,
I'll work with Paul on the environmental thing, and I'll work with David Ropiak on the risk messaging. Is that okay, Gary?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, I was going to volunteer also for the risk messaging only because I've already engaged the Board of Health before they went into other important things. So
Well,
I think
the only
getting-
thing you need to be careful of is, I mean, I'm not sure, Marcia, are they working as two individuals? Like, it would be better if one of you would take the risk messaging and the other would, I don't want to violate open meeting law, so you can't form a subcommittee.
I think if Paul does one, Pam does the other, they could talk to one another about them. Paul might have something where he puts it to Pam and wants her feedback, but not to work together as a committee, a subcommittee of this group. Paul should
Got that, guys? So Paul, you're doing the environmental assessment. Pam, you're doing the risk messaging, and you guys are free to talk to each other.
Okay.
And can I mean, the other thing is that Paul is co-chair of this committee, and I am chair of another committee. Can't, Marcia, we communicate as chairs of our relative committees?
If you're making a recommendation together, you're a subcommittee, and you cannot do that without open meeting law.
Okay.
So we'll report back at
We'll
the
be
next
careful.
meeting. Paul, whatever you have to report back at the next meeting from your environmental assessment work, you'll report back. Pam, you will make recommendations on risk communication, but as individual citizens, you are obviously free to talk to each other.
The other one I just want to volunteer quickly for is 7, because I'm on the Recreation Commission. I think it's a lot. We just had a meeting, so we're not going to be able to discuss this for probably another month or so. But I think it makes sense for me to kind of do number 7.
Excellent.
I could work on 2 or the finance one. I forget what number it was.
Marcia, are you taking notes on who's volunteering for what?
I am.
Yeah, we both are.
Okay. Oh, thank you, because I'm not. That's what I wanted to make sure. So great. Thank you. Number 2, taken care of. So that takes care of.
And 6,
I could
right?
work on 6 if you need me to help on 6 in any way.
2 and 6 for Carl. Right, Gary?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay.
Jim, did you say you were looking into number 5 already about housing
Yes, yeah.
needs?
And but I would like to work on that. So I would try on that and see what help I can get from members of the CHDC as well, both in terms of how much do we need, and then what could be involved in terms of the kind of buildings that could be part of it. So that's what I had in mind.
And Jim, Regional Housing Services Office and my office could also help inform that. So we'd be happy to work with you.
I've done a little communication already for the last couple of weeks, trying to get a sense from what people have done. And I don't know enough, but I know that I don't know enough, so I have to learn more. I'll do that. The other thing I should mention is I spent an awful lot of time really trying to find an example of housing being built in an area, as I think I mentioned before, exposed to radiation activities. And I have to say, this has come up a couple of times. I haven't found a single one yet in the country. It almost things, I'm sure something's happened, but I haven't been able to find it. And I've been through about 14 different sites where work was done, and frequently people just will use this for not environmental, but for maybe purposes of the land that looks good, et cetera. So that's the other thing I've spent time. I'm continuing to look for the example of something that will work.
Yeah.
Here, because it worked out.
Well, you know, to that point, although there were radioactive materials that were used at the site isn't being cleaned up due to radioactivity.
I understand that, Paul.
So it's not, when you look for examples, it's really looking, contaminated sites as opposed to radioactive sites. This is not a radioactive site.
Okay, I used the wrong word. Nuclear materials were at these different locations that I'm talking about. So,
right.
And the feedback I've had from a couple of people that I know is we would never, even though the government says we've cleaned the place all up, et cetera. No, we want nothing to do with that. So sure. That's what I'm looking for. It's nice to know that it may be a difficult sell.
And so I think this talks a little bit about the relationship between some of these things. So coming back to number 2, Carl, you're going to look for some examples, relevant examples of redevelopment efforts. And I don't know, when we get to public comment, we can ask Kate. I know Kate had expressed some interest in looking into the similar, case studies or examples of redevelopment. So she may be able to help you a little bit on that as a member of the public. And I know that there was an example, Paul, that you sent around of a cleanup. It was, I think, more of a chemical hazard or something like that, not?
There are a couple. I mean, Superfund sites, they're hard to find, but there are state cleanup sites in the country. And I think I had some examples. I can just give that information, pass it on to Carl, because I had compiled that. There are some sites. There was a school built in Connecticut on a PCB contaminated site. It's not residential, but yeah.
Right. And while we can't deliberate, I think it would be valuable, Carl, as you and potentially Kate, start collecting examples of these kinds of cleanups. I think feeding that information to Jim would be useful for his work in trying to think about what kind of housing, if he can see examples of how housing has been developed on various types of contaminated sites that have been cleaned up, maybe that would help.
Yep, and Paul and anyone else, if you know of any examples I should look into, please send them my way.
Also, this is an important component of number 1, because discussing risk in the abstract versus here's some examples where people have dealt with this. I think that's also an input to number 1.
And I see Kate giving us a thumbs up symbol, so I'm going to assume she'll have positive comments during public comment. But I just want to see if we've taken care of everything on this list. 4, we're not going to touch right now. 5 is Jim. Finance. Oh, I know we skipped institutional relationships with the town. And I was hoping we might recruit Steve Ng, who I notice is not here today.
And I think Steve has moved out of town and is no longer a member of your committee. So I did copy him, but I think he's gone.
Where did Steve move?
I think he moved into Cambridge.
Yes, he did.
Great. I mean, too bad for us, but Good for him. I love Cambridge. Okay, so institutional relationships with the town. I guess maybe that'll be me. I don't know. Public-private partnerships, long-term development. So I'll do some thinking about that.
Gary,
Are there
I think number 8 is really important, but for the life of me, I don't know how, it's such a big issue, especially now, but we discussed this earlier. So there's planning or recommending uses for this site in a vacuum with all the other things going on in town.
Yeah.
It's like a great idea, but I don't know how to really tackle that, or anybody
To
would
me,
tackle
that
right
seems
now.
like a combination of two things. It's going to be, when we do this outreach, I think Marcia's right that we're going to, go out to the public, but we also should be reaching out to the committees we talked to before, so we can send this email blast to the committee chairs. And I think we can frame number 8 in that context. Say, we're asking the public for input, but you, committee chair, also please let us know if you see. And this goes to, I think there's a long-term capital planning committee that I think we want to make sure we target. So I think this number 8 is the question that we send out, and that's part 1, is getting feedback from other committees. But then the other half of number 8, I think we task the select board. In our report, we say, look, here's some due diligence, some information on how site planning could take place. You have to work out the ownership issues and the legal issues, and you, select board, have to figure out where this fits within other town priorities. So I hear you, Paul, that's tricky.
Yeah,
and I think
that makes sense. What you just said makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So those 2 pieces, I think, will take care of that. And then you're doing 7, so I think that's it. Balance of, so 2 and 6, Carl. Okay, and then I'll work on 3.
And we've added number 10, the whatever we call that, environmental assessment.
Okay. Yeah, well, that can be 9.
And 9 was going to be Linda. 9 was going to be Linda.
Okay, if
The
we
legal.
leave 9 as legal questions, ownership questions, sure. We can
I
ask.
think I said 5.
Yep, and Jim's 5. Right. Okay. That's great. So I guess we had an agenda item. I want to go to public comment. Maybe we can do that first. And then there is this, I don't know, final discussion, consideration of generic plans. I guess we've sort of said, we've talked a lot about all of that.
Yeah,
and I think we already have these slides. So maybe we've kind of covered that. So
Gary, could you ask call-in user 1 to identify him or herself for the minutes?
oh, yeah, in fact, they have a hand raised. So at this time, I would call on call-in user 1 to identify themselves.
They need to unmute,
Yeah.
or Jeremy needs to unmute them.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. This is Linda Escobedo. Good morning, everybody. I was unable to get on the regular Zoom this morning, so that's why I'm calling in. A comment based on an earlier conversation, and that is, as you think about walking up to the committee recommendation for the existing plan for each of the areas, and it could just be my selective hearing here, but I continue to hear an either or kind of thinking about section A2. And my comment there is that I don't think it has to be either or necessarily. And I just want to make that comment. And the other comment I would make is that in terms of the environmental assessment, which I think is important, the impact report, I'm assuming that also includes traffic considerations in terms of off-site versus on-site fill, in addition to the quality and all kinds of other things.
It does.
Okay, good.
Can you clarify what you mean by it doesn't have to be an either or?
Well, I think it was in the final report
You mean you could level half the hill?
Sure. There was a suggestion that a buffer of trees could be kept
Mhm.
and still take fill from part of that section. But I don't hear that necessarily coming up as one of the several options in the
I'm gonna
committee
say that,
discussion.
yeah, that is, I think the assumption was that a buffer of trees would get left if the site were leveled for aesthetics on Route 62. That would not help the animals necessarily in that area, but it would be pretty. But that's part of leveling. That's not but certainly there, you could have some percentage as
But-
well that's not a whole or.
To Linda's point, I think, Paul, it's important when you do an environmental assessment, say if you clear 30% of the hill, 60% of the hill, or all of the hill, or whatever it is, have some shades of gray in there.
Yeah, and I have to go back to Bruce because his calculus for how much fill he needed, it was not the entire hill, it was some part of it. I'll figure out what the starting point was for his thinking.
And, I think, in terms of Linda's comment about making sure all of the environmental benefit, I think, again, I can give you names, Pam, but, to the Friends of Trees of Concord, they see significant environmental benefits of having mature trees left standing. So you want to make sure that that's accounted for somehow in his assessment. And I know there are things like the iTree model that talk about groundwater benefits and things like that. So it just heads up. If you leave that stuff out, you're going to get some flack. But
Can you spell iTree model for me?
I-tree.
Thank you.
It's a U.S. Forest Service model, I think.
Okay.
So having comment, again, am I still on?
Yep.
Having just made that comment, which I think is important, there's also a new wave of environmental interest in trees, taking an somewhat opposing view that if you look at the average longevity of trees versus planting new trees in the impact that they will have, so there's a new wave of thought on that. So I just add that for what it's worth. Yeah,
no, there's definitely, I know, some strong feelings about, replacing trees is not equivalent. That, mature trees have greater benefit than, twice as many immature trees. But I don't know.
But I'm saying there's pushback from the environmental community on that as well.
Oh.
That's my point.
Yep. Okay. Okay. Any other comments from you, Linda? And maybe you can just comment on the legal issues that we're asking. We had sent along a thing to the select board chair recommending that town council be engaged. Do you know if around the ownership questions and the liens, and do you know if that happened? I'm
going to assume that that's not been acted on. We've been meeting every week and we've had pretty full agendas. So I'm going to guess that may have been put aside up until now. But we'll try to reintroduce the concept.
Yeah, maybe we can just send along a reminder when, obviously you have more important things on your plate, but this is going to be crucial for the town at some point soon. So.
Well, the other aspect of that, Gary, is that the legal budget is oversubscribed, and without a town meeting vote to establish a new legal budget, we do not have the financial resources right now. So if this is not determined to be a critical item at this point in time, it is probably going to be delayed until after town meeting.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Yeah, so I wonder, this comes back to a point we discussed earlier. I think this report that we're going to deliver in December, we're going to have to say, certain things are still outstanding, and this legal question may wind up being one of them, along with market research. In the time of COVID, in the time of overextended legal budgets, we're not going to be able to fulfill 100% of our charge, but here are two things that we'll leave on the table. I don't know. Okay, other public comment. I see that Kate McEnany is online.
Hi, I'll go next. Yes, thanks. So a couple thoughts, and I think I'll go from what I perceive as sort of like easiest to maybe most complex. On the issue of doing some background research and due diligence on other projects in the state and the region, and maybe across the country in terms of finding something for housing. I am happy to do that, and if you want to just link me up with someone from the committee to talk about what it is exactly I'm looking for, that would be helpful to me, just to make sure I'm doing something that's most helpful if I am putting some time into it. I do think that it would help. I've heard this word contextualize come up a lot. I think that could be part of it. When Gary very helpfully presented, did the presentation before the planning board, I did kind of crave a slide that was examples projects from around Massachusetts. And I know that might not necessarily get to the kind of horizon where you guys are working, but I think in terms of public outreach, I do think it's helpful to just create that sort of environment of what this world of redeveloping Superfund sites looks like, even like literally, like here's a building. And I also just think from my experience, becoming familiar with other projects, and maybe even, walking around other project sites, even if it's not exactly applicable, usually that, can help crystallize questions or thoughts or bring up new ideas, and then maybe eventually establishing relationships with folks who were lead, in a committee or for the town in developing those. So for example, Jim mentioned he's been having a hard time finding a housing, an example of a successful housing project. So it might be interesting to talk to a couple different leads from different projects and understand what their thinking was. Did they actually carry a housing option for 90% of the way, if then didn't actually come to fruition? So I do put my offer to help do some of this background research, which I think first would just be a table of here's the project, here's where it is, here's what the contamination was, here's what they ended up building. Are there any other lessons learned here that are easy to glean? So I think that would be the first step. So I'm happy to do that. The next thing I would just mention quickly as an idea, I think it would be great to go out to the public with some of these decisions and to go beyond the committees. I'll just mention that the election is coming up in June, and maybe if you could, that would be another way to advertise that if you do a survey, that's out there and people should participate, either when they're going into the polls or putting it up on the page where people request the ballot at home. And let's see. So I think my final point is getting to this kind of the point of the tree people, and I might be one of them, notwithstanding that I'm on the planning board, which is primarily interested in development. I was interested. My question when I saw Gary's presentation is, why isn't there an option that's fundamentally different from these other three, which is to preserve the site for all intents and purposes? So here's the lesson from Chernobyl and some where it was so bad that we let it revert back to the use of wolves and birds and trees and plants. And there's sort of a, restorative environmental justice story there. But I think that, I think there might be a reason, and it may go to the economics of this, that we can't look at mostly leaving the site alone. But I think that story, if that's the case, I would want that story told, because I think the question is immediately, from my perspective on the planning board, we hear a lot from people that are really heartbroken about open space being developed and a development period, new buildings going up, smaller buildings turning into bigger buildings, the loss of habitat, the loss of plants, pervious surfaces and concerns about the climate change. And so I'm just wondering if this is actually an opportunity to actually preserve land rather than develop it. And I wonder if, you included that option, it's actually more important to develop that as an option because it could have a fundamentally different looking trajectory in terms of how we could actually make that happen. So I guess I'm interested in your response to that in terms of including that as an option. I mean, it's as difficult as it is to develop the site. I think it might potentially is even more difficult to not develop it, but that might actually be, if we could do it, what we want to do. And I have a train going by, so I'm gonna mute myself and turn it back to the committee.
Can I just comment on that a little bit? First of all, the SKIO report does at the end have a column called "Leave It Alone." I'm not sure we've actively discussed it, but the report has that in there for discussion. I think early on, when we talked about how much the cleanup and the $250 million taxpayer funds in cleaning this up to residential standards, weighing that against just doing nothing with the site, and at the same time, there's each of these scenarios has half the site remaining as undeveloped and for environmental purposes. So there's, I think we've discussed some of those, but my sense is we're spending a lot of money cleaning up the site, and we are, by design, leaving half of it alone, and probably more than half it alone at the end of the day. That the total leaving alone option begs the question, well, why did we insist that the town, that EPA clean this up to residential standards? So there's,
Yeah.
doesn't totally answer your question, but I think that we've gone through that calculus a little bit.
I think it is a good response, because I was going to say, we did talk about it as a committee, and I think we decided that on balance, one, given the investment, versus Chernobyl, where they invested zero and it's returning to nature. Here we're investing, $250 million. And the idea is there should be some return on that investment in terms of development capacity. But yeah, the fact that we felt as a committee that the right balance was to leave half of it alone, or 20 acres or something like that, I think would be, reverting back to more open space, and that we should think about, what's the right way to develop the other half. That seemed like a balance. But yeah, we would welcome your input, Kate, and volunteer efforts. And I'll email you, connect you to Carl and Paul. I think, didn't we already have some examples of cleanup that you had put together? I don't know if it was in a table or some document.
We did. There are 3 or 4. I'll have to dig that out so I can get that information.
Yeah. SKIO had, I think, 2 examples as well.
Just as a hint, it's harder to find Superfund sites, which are federal sites. They're somewhat easier to find state sites. There's state cleanup programs around the country that dealt with the same thing. So there's a lot of information beyond Superfund out there on site cleanups.
But I'll connect Kate to Carl, and Paul, if you can send your examples to Carl also,
Sure.
Then you guys can start to put together a table or something. Okay, any other comments from the committee or the public or Marcia or Linda?
I just had one other comment. Just I'm continuing to track the natural resource damage process and settlements. It's not progressing very fast in the state, but it is a potential revenue, well, for use at the site for natural resource restoration. So, on the issue of what we're doing with the site, there's going to be money at some point available for natural resource restoration projects.
Could that include like a nature viewing area?
Yes, absolutely. That is very much high on the list of those kind of projects. So, keeping my fingers crossed, there's funding available that the state will let us use at this site, because that doesn't always happen. But so I'm keeping my eye on that.
Great. Okay. Unless anyone else has parting shots, I'll go ahead and.
So I wanted to ask about last time I wasn't at the meeting. Did somebody else take minutes?
I think
think
I
I
may
did.
have, the minutes are probably on my desk at the office. And I'll go back and look for them.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose it. So, thanks.
I'm wondering if we should schedule another meeting if we're going to review what I draft and put something out to the public and get feedback in time to inform Bruce by July. It seems like we need to get a meeting on the schedule like within 2 weeks or so.
June 12 or June 19, what do people think?
You're currently scheduled for June 12th. So if Jeremy is available to set up a Zoom meeting for us, we could do that.
Okay.
Yep, that works for me.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep, that's good.
Thank you, Jeremy.
So yeah, let's try and report back on initial progress on these areas by June 12th, and definitely we'll make a plan at that time for the public outreach based on what we get from Carl.
Excellent.
Okay,
Great.
lots of work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Good call. Bye.
Bye-bye.